The world is going faster.
Data is growing exponentially.
We need answers now.
How can AI help?
We need more data.
We need JGP.ai.
I need to talk about documentation. This is a nightmare for a lot of teams and a nightmare for a lot of projects. And I don't remember a project where I was happy with the documentation. And I'm not saying that the project I'm on have good documentation, but there's an easy way of avoiding the documentation nightmare. First, making sure that the documentation is alive, okay? You may be aware that us as U.S. taxpayers, we are financing this new aircraft, this new Air Force One. Okay, it's going to come to an airport near you in 2025. But the documentation for this aircraft costs $84 million, and it's more than 100,000 pages. This is not the kind of documentation I'm speaking about. Documentation is there to build efficient engineering teams. It's not about copy-pasting things you find on the internet and putting on your internal wiki. It's a living organism. It's living with the team. And over time, adapted this pyramid of views, which I think is covering all aspects of the technical documentation. As you see the first one at the bottom, it reads from, like the pyramid of Maslow's, it reads from the bottom to the top. It's really starting with a wider audience until really an operational audience, which is usually not the biggest audience in your project. So it starts with a context viewpoint, which describes the relationships and the dependencies between your systems, okay, and between the environment, which is the people, systems, external entities, etc. It's a very high-level view, and it's really about system thinking. The next step is a functional view, which is describing the runtime of each element. Okay, so that's a little bit more the responsibility of each component, their interface, their primary interactions. That's that level of things. And then you define the information viewpoint, which is really data. It can be database, system stores, how you manipulate the data, how you distribute it, etc. But this is usually where I put my ERD diagrams there. Then you've got the concurrency. Depending on your project, you may just skip it. But it's really interesting to understand a little bit what's going on and what's concurrent in your system, especially when you design real-time systems or where concurrency is really important. Finally, you've got your development documentation, okay, what the developer needs to know, how the nodes they take during the project, and then the next step is deployment, okay, how do you deploy, which is coming back to the CI/CD before, as we are deploying as we develop. And this documentation is here. And finally, you've got your operational document is, hey, when I'm giving it to the pure ops people, please read this documentation about how this is structured. So when you've got the 7 viewpoints, it makes things a little bit easier than to have this humongous data that you've got to put in structure. Okay, so that's one kind of guidelines I'm following. And of course, we could have a full session on really implementing this methodology. I'd like also to spend a little bit of time on security. Security has not always been the priority on project. And if you remember my previous diagram, I kind of had security gates, and then we just look the previous gates worth of work, okay, and it's really not enough. It's really you've got to implement really security as a culture. And this means that you've got to change the way you work. And this is where you start, not only because of security, but because of all this numerous numbers of actors, that you've got to make a way to scale this work process. And this is where I like to use a methodology called SAFe, which stands for Scalable Agile Framework. And I've been lucky enough to see that scale in several of my lifetimes, and this is really where you can see how you can apply Agile and get the framework. And it's a framework, you don't have to take it all, but you've got all the tools to make sure that you can build your successful teams from sprint over sprint, combined in program increments that enables you to sync with the different elements in the company. So yeah, Agile, and more precisely, safe. So I think it's about time to conclude already. And as we're going through all this content pretty fast, but the first conclusion is just don't bother. Listen to people near me that just said, don't bother. Just go to Stack Overflow and copy paste everything, right? Well, not really, would I say. But anyway, I'd like to compare the then and now situation. In the past, I would say we had some kind of predictable loads, okay? And now we have to think about scalable architectures. Everything was database-centric, but now we're focusing a lot more on the customer. We want to give him a good experience, not only seeing IT as a transaction-based system. In the past, a lot of things were processed as batches, and now we want near real time. IT was really based on a need, okay? We had to do something, but now it's all ubiquitous. You've got your phone, you've got your iPad, you've got your computer. You don't leave home without a computer on you. And before, we also were really hardware dependent, and the cloud has kind of made us a little bit independent for that. And where security was merely a concern before, we've got to embrace security as a culture. With all that, thank you very much, and let's open it for questions. So I've seen a few questions or comments in the chat. So yeah, log files are made of history, and log files are real important, especially in the DevOps way of thinking as well, where you've got to measure everything and keep track of everything. So log files are precious, and they need to be analyzed and kept and archived. So for sure. I'm probably not going to share the slides. I'm okay to share the recording, and it's going to be also on YouTube. Yeah. So, other comments, questions? Are you going to buy your parts at Auto Parts now? At Advanced Auto Parts?
Either that or AutoZone.
Well, then we are not friends anymore. Yeah, well, so one of the question is, what are the pitfalls of not providing proper documentation? And this first is, what is proper documentation? Proper documentation means also that it's relevant documentation. It's documentation that is matching your system, okay? And that's why it's a living organism. It's not like you do the documentation and then you code, and then you've got discrepancies. But it's really about matching the documentation and the right level. And if you don't have it, well, I've seen that on several projects. The first phase of the evolution or the maintenance of your project is going to be about reverse engineering and reverse documenting your project. And this might be a very complex task because you don't know what people had in mind. You don't know what people were thinking. You don't know what resulted in these decisions. And sometimes you even have to go back to the source code. And sometimes you don't have the source code because it's only compiled code. So documentation is really critical. And it doesn't have to be tons and tons of documents, but a few diagrams explaining the flows, explaining who were the stakeholders, explaining what was in mind, some of the decisions being made on the project. This is really. Can you talk about a couple of trunks which did not succeed or at least never became as popular or pervasive as anticipated and speculated. Why not? Oof. Do you start with a vision and strategy document before you start a project? Actually, that's a very good question. Usually, yes, I do. I do, but it's not me because it depends on the role on the company. But I always love to have this triptych of vision, strategy or strategies, and tactics. Okay, and a lot of people I worked with over the years are a little bit confused about putting the tactics first. Okay, and I really like the idea of having the vision, and we all align to the vision. And based on this vision, then you can define strategies, and based on the strategies, you can define the tactics. So that's yeah. I didn't. This talk doesn't talk about the different roles. It was mainly kind of technical roles, but this is something that your product manager or should bring, or even to the portfolio product manager should bring to the table and share with the team, so they align and they share and they have this common vision. This is an excellent comment. I like that. How much security is implemented in an open source cloud? So I don't know what you mean by open source cloud, but a lot of the products that are when you look at some of the cloud offering, and I'm going to pick on the favorite thing I like to pick on, which is Amazon EMR. So EMR is Elastic MapReduce, okay, and so it's a bundle of Apache, Hadoop, Spark. They all combine together, make a distribution, and they call that EMR, and that's available on AWS. They are not current on the versions because they have to have some kind of at least minimum security reviews of what they're going to deploy, as they might be liable, to deploying things that don't work. So in that way, yeah, it makes sense to that the components that or the version of those components that are being deployed on their cloud makes sense. Okay. So and makes sense in the ways that it's that it matches your need on your project. So if you need Spark 3 and EMR is only delivering Spark 245, for example, well then you're stuck, of course, but you've got to wait and you create a dependency on your project. So Kevin, yeah. So how do you propose to keep the documentation up to date? Do you have a user story for someone to update a doc for code being updated concurrently, or do it for the code that was completed in the previous sprint? I see concurrently being difficult as the code may change until the last few days. But what is your experience here? So it depends on what the granularity of your documentation is. Okay, I believe strongly that code documentation should not be outside of the code. That's a personal feeling I have. So when it comes to really documenting code, it should be in the code, and that's part of your code reviews. Okay, so when you've got all this pull request at the end of your sprint, people will just look at the code and say, hey, just add your comments here. Okay, but that's also part of your definition of done. So one very important thing is you've got to align with your Scrum Master about your definition of done. If your definition of done does not include documentation, yeah, you cannot blame anyone. But it's not a different user story. You can imagine at the end of the project, or if you want I was on a project where we decided to phase out or temporarily phased out a project. So we had specific user stories for writing documentation in the context of phasing it down. So we could keep track of what was happening. But this is not. I would say this is not the rule, but the default rule. Okay. For me, documentation is part of the definition of done, but the documentation you're tracking is also the more high-level documentation. It's not your code documentation. Your code documentation is in your code. Yep, comments in the code, as you said, and not a separate design document that you. Oh, of course. I'm sorry if I misled you there. You've got your architects, okay, and like your enterprise architect or your solutions architect, and those people are responsible for the architecture. And if you see that you find impediments as you develop or during the sprint, then you've got to update your documentation, right? And that's part of the architecture documents. And of course, it's linked to the developers, but it's not. We're not in this gated project anymore. It's not the architect do something and write all this waterfall documentation, and then the developer takes over. Okay, they work in sync. Okay, and on the project I'm on, I've got a great solution architect who's working in sync with the developers and is doing this as the developers go further. Is taking all this intake and making sure that everything is in sync. Yeah, and Swagger. I mentioned a few times payload before, and Swagger is a great tool, or Swagger Hub is a great tool for synchronizing and building and describing payloads together. Okay, I used to love another tool which was called Restlet Studio, which I think was even better than Swagger Hub, but it's not available anymore. But yeah, typically your Swagger file and more than that's even so the Swagger file can define your payload, can define your endpoints, but it defines a contract that both systems have in a microservice architecture, the consumer and the server. Yep, exactly.
It's Victor. Can you hear me this time?
Yeah.
Okay, I had too many places I had to unmute. The crux of my question was, we've talked about trends and tools and, technologies and so forth, where we are today. I'm curious if anything stands out in your mind, a couple examples of some technologies or standards or languages or whatever, which at the time appeared that they were headed for, widespread adoption, technical acceptance, et cetera, but in reality sort of petered out within 2 or 3 or 5 years. And if so, any idea why, what might have been lacking there?
Well, I think our industry is full of do's, okay? One I've got on top of my mind is Ruby on Rails, and you've got to have a critical mass at some point. And if you don't reach this critical mass, then your tool is condemned to be in oblivion at some point. Okay, so that's why I'm also trying when I pick up tools as part of my EA work to make sure that it's something that is mature and that is not going to disappear right away. And that's not an easy task. Okay, how do you do that? How do you do that for an open source tool? Because it's open source, so you still have the source code, right? But so it's part of this. But there's plenty of examples. I was picking on Ruby on Rails because I had a discussion not long ago with a friend. But there's plenty of things, and there's also false alerts. Okay, I was making fun of a little earlier in this talk about NoSQL. There was this trend at some point where NoSQL is going to take over SQL, okay, and traditional relational database, and everybody thought so. To a point where the next thing is Mongo, and you had this Mongo stack, and and then you had Elastic, and all those things. So they have their place, and I love a lot of them, but the relational database is not replaced. Okay, so there's a lot of marketing in our industry, and it drives some decisions sometimes which are a little bit crazy, and we make mistakes. I used another example was a toolkit from Google called GWT. Okay, GWT, Google Web Toolkit. It was a toolkit that Google came to build UI based on Java, and then it would be compiled into JavaScript and run in the browser, and it gave great result until they decided to do Angular, and until Facebook decided to share React and all the bazillion JavaScript frameworks. So and it was a good idea. And I had a few projects with a good friend of mine, and we had awesome results, awesome user experiences. But we could not. It was not trend shifted.
Thank you.
Welcome. Anyone from the select groups that want to say something?
Thank you so much, JG, for your time today. And thank you guys for all joining us. Appreciate all the questions. We'll have the recording out to you later on this afternoon. Hope you guys have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
Get more by following JG Perrin on Twitter.
Check all talks on YouTube at jgp.ai/yt.